without further ado, I'm going to introduce the next speaker, who is called Oskar Stålberg, and who is an indie developer, and who's going to talk about Beyond the Townscaper. A big round of applause.
Boop, boop. Good morning, everyone. Big turnout, lovely to see. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about, this is my last game, Townscaper. You might have seen it on Twitter. It's barely a game. You just build beautiful buildings. And apparently that's enough to sell copies. It just looks like this. You build things, and then there's... Oh, my mouse button is kind of stuck. And then, yeah, there's like some really clever algorithms running underneath that kind of figures out how to turn whatever you build into something that looks kind of coherent and hopefully also somewhat beautiful. So you can make little stairs, and you can make these weird sort of steel pillars and stuff like that. So obviously this kind of is, a lot what this is what would normally be a level design tool in a game, but that I just turned into a game in and of itself. Which means that I could skip a lot of the things that you would have to do if it's a level design tool, and I could add a bunch of juice that you wouldn't add if it was just a level design tool. How many people here have worked with any kind of tile-based systems or procedural systems in their game? Yeah, a couple. So this is probably going to be somewhat relevant to you. So obviously, what goes on in Townscaper is a bunch of different things, but one of the main innovations going into Townscaper is the grid. And this is what the grid looks like. So obviously, I had this idea when I built Townscaper that I wanted to create architectural environments, but that looked kind of European with like organic city streets, and you know, like a way nice towns usually look like is like you try and build nice symmetrical buildings, but then the street is kind of weird and shifted, so you had to build it at like a slightly weird angle. So you always try and achieve this kind of perfect symmetry, but then you never manage to because it's always a bit weird and it needs to fit next to the other buildings, and then you need to like alter the like half side of the building for some reason, or yeah. So that's the kind of the feel I wanted to have in Townscaper, and it's kind of a problem I've been thinking about for a long time, because when you make architectural structures, it makes a lot of sense to use tiles, because a benefit of using tiles is that as long as they're kind of standardized and fit together nicely, you get to employ a lot of sort of artistic discretion in how you handcraft them and what kind of elements you place into them. Because architectural environments are made out of all kinds of different things. So if you want to sort of model all those things procedurally, that's a lot of different systems going into how do arches work, how do windows work, how does those kind of things work. But that's exactly the kind of thing that an artist might be good at. So using tiles is a good way to kind of combine the procedural elements that place the tiles and then the artistic elements of how you handcraft the tiles. So yeah, a main innovation in Townscaper is the grid, because architectural things are kind of mostly squarish, but as I said, not entirely squarish, because then it looks like New York or something like that. If you look at this grid, yeah, you can build houses that are kind of pentagons, or that are kind of triangles like this one, or even hexagons like this one. But if you look at the actual like lines of the grids here, you can see that the grid is actually entirely made out of quads, not squares, because they kind of have to be squeezed a bit and skewed a bit to fit together properly. Because they don't just fit together in a straight grid. But they're all quads. They all have 4 corners, which means that the kind of modules I can use to create them. Let's see if this seam works properly. Oh, but I can't see the wireframes properly. Well, this is kind of the... let's turn on maybe selection wireframe. See if that helps. Yeah, it helps a little bit. So here's kind of all the modules. They don't have the proper textures and shading here. This is mostly just for debug purposes. But you can see all the different like modules that go into creating. Like here you can clearly see this is like 4 corners of a house, or 2 corners of a house. There's like half a chimney. So if you would mirror that one, you would get full chimney. So you can, so a hexagonal house like this one is actually like a small square house. Is obviously made out of like 4 corners that I manually build, and a hexagonal house is just made out of 6 corners. But they're all built from square corners, so that means that if I stick to that standard, I can make all the things I want in that standard, and then I just skew them a little bit to make them fit together in this grid. And that's an incredibly helpful way to think about tiles. So I drew these little diagrams. So here's an example of like two classical grids you might use in a game, a square grid and a hex grid. And here's like some environments you might want to put on a square grid or a hex grid. And now, if you want to make a tile-based game, you need to start slicing these up into tiles that you can create that you can then put back into the game. And a conundrum we can see here is that the interesting bits of the environment actually fall, like the transitions, the little cliff, actually falls right on the edges between the tiles. And that so it'd be quite awkward to draw those tiles with like half a cliff on them and stuff like that. So what people normally do is, this is a very common technique, you just kind of push everything inward a little bit, so the cliffs fall entirely inside the tiles, or you push outward a little bit so the cliff falls like outside the tiles. And that's like, then this is your transition tile, and then you have like full tiles like that. This is some drawbacks. One drawback is, and you see this in a lot of 2D tile-based games, where if you push it inward like this, yeah, you can have nice big round outer corners, convex corners on things, but you actually can't fit nice round concave corners on things, because like the cliff is right up against the edge, so you don't have any space for rounding, basically. Or you can choose to do the opposite, so you have really sharp and small convex corners, but really wide concave corners. So like it's common if you look at 2D games, you'll see the beaches go like whoop, chip, whoop, chip, whoop, chip, or the opposite, depending on where you choose to slice it. And there's the equivalent way of slicing it on the hex grid, as you can see here. And obviously, of course, this means that you have to create a lot of tiles to satisfy all the neighbor constraints. Like what you have to think about a territory around the tile, like this tile here. You have to think about all its 8 neighbors, so like the 3x3 neighborhood. A different way of slicing the tiles is slicing the tiles like this. This is based on a concept called graph duality. So a grid is a graph, but a graph is also a broader mathematical concept. And every graph has a dual graph. That is, like a dual is a symmetrical relationship between two graphs. So you can see, let's look at this thing here. You can clearly see that the triangular grid and the hexagonal grid have a dual relationship to each other. Each hexagon turns into the vertex of a triangle, and each vertex between the hexagons turns into the face of a triangle. And it's the same relationship backwards as well. And in the square case, that just means it's the same operation, but the result is just offsetting the grid by half a unit. So what that means if you build your tiles like that instead is that you need way fewer tiles to achieve all the things you want to achieve. You need to, so instead of like these little triangles here, like these, if you have a 3D environment, you only need these 4 little triangle modules to accomplish this hexagonal scene here. Whereas if you would use this method, you would need quite a lot of different tiles to do it. So these can all be like, if you can rotate and mirror these, you can, well, you don't even need to mirror them actually. If you can rotate these, you can accomplish this scene here. And that also means that you have the transition, which like the transition in this case is, you know, going from land to water, is where you usually want to place the interesting aesthetical details. Like you don't need to necessarily tell the player over and over, hey, this is grass, this is grass, this is grass, this is grass. But you want to tell the player, hey, this is grass, and here's a border, and there's a cliff, and then there's water, and then there's a bit of waves. It's in the transitions most of the interesting visual things are supposed to happen. And if you slice the tiles like this, instead of the two other cases I showed you, it means you get the most sort of visual space on the tile to use for transitions. And that's great for things, field-like things, so terrain, for example, or buildings that are like large and amorphous, and yeah, but other things, of course, you don't want to slice like this, like houses that are small, or characters, for example. You slice them normally, you place them on the hexagons or the squares, depending on which kind of grid you're using. Then there's other kinds of features. I choose rivers in this case, which I treated it like they work in Civilization, which is like features that exist between the tiles, on the border between tiles. So that's this. It's the same thinking there. You want to give them as much visual space as possible. So if you place them on the triangles, in the hexagonal case, you get them running nicely from side to side. You can do nice curves. It's perfect. And then you have things like roads, which are like seemingly very similar to rivers. In the square case, they're very, very similar to rivers, but in the hexagonal case, they're quite different, because the rivers go like from triangle side to triangle side, so you can never have more than 3 rivers meeting at a junction. But roads, you could theoretically have up to 6 roads meeting at a junction in the hexagonal case. This is exactly like Civ works, for example. And this is, of course, because if you have a game where you move from tile to tile, you want them to move on the roads but over the rivers. Probably. I mean, if your game is different, then this is not the solution for you. Or you might use a slightly different solution. So this is, of course, how Townscaper works as well. So the grid the player interacts with has pentagons and hexagons and triangles, but the dual grid of that grid, which is where all of the generation happens and most of the generation happens, and all of the modules are placed, is all made of quads, which means I can just feed it quad tiles. Yeah, and there's also like some things obviously work better in hexagonal environments and some things work better in square environments. One common thing is that like to use square environments for things that are more architectural because they tend to be square, and use organic environments for like world maps and stuff like that. So it makes sense that like a turn-based shooting game like XCOM is set on a square grid, whereas Civ is set on a hexagonal grid. Makes perfect sense. But they both have some like strength and benefits other than that. One benefit of the hexagonal grid is, yeah, you get these nice organic lines. A clear drawback is that the scale of the resolution of the grid is super obvious. So once you start zooming out, you start seeing like this wavy line here looks quite nice. But if it would continue for a long way, you would see like a continuous wavy line going along what kind of should be a straight coastal line. Again, it's sort of a it should just be a straight line. It shouldn't attract a lot of attention, but then it's wavy, so it does attract attention. So it doesn't really look nice. The square grid doesn't have that drawback. Here you have nice, long, straight lines. So the interesting things can happen in the corners, and you can have sort of long straight lines as sort of just transmissions between the corners. But I wanted to, so something, yeah, I did Townscaper, and now I started a new procedural project that looks like this so far. It's pretty early on, so I haven't done any texturing or shading or anything like that. I've just started working on the mesh generation. And here I'm trying to do a bunch of things that I couldn't really accomplish in Townscaper, and I'm trying to get the best out of both square grids and triangular grids, because just some features work better in some in square, and some work better on triangles or in hexagons. And the way I'm doing this is, let's look at the modules for this one. Yeah, here we go. So this thing actually takes a mix of, you can see like the above section here is all triangular tiles. So this is just what they look like when I export them from Maya. And down here, we have a bunch of square tiles. And some features work really good on the triangles, like like rivers, for example, because you almost never want more than 3 rivers to meet a junction anyway. But some features really should live on the square grid. And it's stuff like where the beach meets a cliffside like this. You kind of want them meeting at a right angle. You don't, because you usually want to avoid having more than one kind of transition happen at a single point. And if you'd be a triangular grid, you would need both a cliff corner and a beach corner and a water corner at one point. But here I can have just the water and beach corner meeting at a straight cliff. And likewise, it's great to have the rivers on the triangulars when they're kind of snaking around and meeting at deltas and stuff like that. But when they're going over a cliff face in waterfall, I like them to be perpendicular to each other, so we can just like come from one side, run over the cliff face, and continue. And that works much better on a square grid. But so how do you use both a square grid and a triangular grid at the same time? Well, that's actually not too difficult. What you do is you slice up the squares to become triangles. So I have like a nice little import script running that takes the mesh I build from Maya, which is, I like working this way. This is how I worked in Townscaper in Bad North as well. I make a huge Maya scene with all my meshes in it, and nothing's named properly, nothing's grouped properly or merged properly or anything like that. And then I export it into Unity, and I just treat it as a big triangle soup and run my analysis and slice it up into pieces inside Unity instead. So this is kind of what I end up with. Then you can see these colorized edges kind of represent how things fit together. So things that have, you see like here's a purple edge and a purple edge. That means they fit together. This looks like it doesn't fit together because it's a a red edge and a green edge, but it does it's because they need to be mirrored versions of each other. So you need to think about mirrors a lot. But yeah, you can see that they are sliced up into triangles. So we got half. This gets sliced that way. But then, of course, you can slice them both ways. So slice it that way and slice it that way. And then I also do like a bunch of generating other versions of each tile that's like slightly shifted, just to get some more variation and to be able to do some interesting transitions, mostly with how these paths work. And it removes all the duplicate modules. So as I scale up here to all the other versions, you will see that there's fewer and fewer modules available, just because they end up being just mirrored or rotated versions of modules that already existed, and then I don't need those. So let's look at this thing generate again. Here you'll see the algorithms running. This is the same. It's actually quite fast this time. The algorithm can fail quite often. You see it running and then it's restarting again. That's when the algorithm fails. It runs into some kind of contradiction. But I've managed to write the algorithm pretty fast this time, so it seems to work well to just restart it until it comes up with something reasonable. And yeah, it's running the algorithm called the wave function collapse, which is one I've worked with for a long time now. It basically can figure out how to configure a coherent level out of the tiles that you build it, which also means that you don't. If the generation is not interactive like it is in Townscaper, you actually don't need to give it that many tiles before it starts giving you reasonable results. So it's not like you need to create a bunch of tiles to satisfy all the possible combinations, but rather you just give it tiles and it figures out how to build something out of those tiles. And yeah, you can see here's the waterfall, here's a house, some basic things. One thing I'm doing as well here. Oh, now it's too fast. We need to see the generation happening. You can see it's generating from the outward in, and that's so it's starting at the edges and generating inwards, and that's for two reasons. One of them is that it's sort of a good rule of thumb when designing natural landscapes. It's not entirely true, but it's mostly true, is that they tend to not have local minimums. So there tends to not be like little pits or depressions in natural landscape, because those then fill up with water and they become lakes, and then the water runs off somewhere, and in the end that becomes a canyon, a ravine instead. So it's very like you do have those kind of evaporative deserts like Salt Lake and stuff like that, but mostly you don't have these kind of local minimums. And of course one way of creating those kind of things is like actually like generating a Perlin noise and then running an erosion algorithm on that until you have a natural landscape. That's good for some things, but it's not good for the kind of things I wanted to do. So I'm kind of doing the erosion backwards. So it's not really proper erosion, but it satisfies that constraint. So if you start at the edge and you know that that's all going to be water, and then for each new tile you place, it is only allowed to build at the same height or upwards. So if you keep doing that, going from one side, then go up, until you can't go up anymore, and then you go from the other side, up, and then they meet. Then you've built a natural environment without any of those local minimums. Another way I'm also going from the inside out is that this is kind of, I don't exactly know what kind of game this is going to become, but I'm thinking of it in terms of this would work for Bad North, which was not my last game, but the game before Townscaper. So then you want the world to be navigable as well. So like you want to make sure that you can walk from the different places of the world to other different places in the world. And one way of doing that is as you are only allowed to add tiles that extend the current navigable environment. So you're always making, like when you add a tile, you see, okay, can I go to here? I can go to here. And you want to add a new one. Can I add, like, does this one add to the navigability, or does it just add a dead end, or does it add a piece of land that's not possible to go to from anywhere? And then you're not allowed to place it. We can also, so this, yeah, as I said, it's all based on a triangular grid at the bottom. So I'm going to see if I can make it run a little bit slower. Here we get to see the triangles get constructed. And then we get to see the algorithm running. And then at the end, when I've placed all the, let's make that one slower as well. I kind of decide how slow to run some of these algorithms here. Let's generate the same seed. So here we see a triangular grid getting created. It's just a Delaunay triangulation, a pretty basic algorithm. Getting relaxed a little bit. And here you can see that I kind of create 3D grid around the triangles that were the modules that were just placed, and then I kind of radically deformed those quite a bit. And that it serves the function of creating a more organic looking environments out of things that are mostly straight, but it also serves some functions of, because some of these modules that went into building this environment were made from squares. So then when I relax those kind of prisms, those cages, those that were built from squares tried to become more square, and those that were built from triangles tried to become more triangular. And then there's also some things like houses, they get to have a larger say in the shape of their triangle. So the end result is always going to be a compromise between the different shapes, the different squares and triangles it wants to become, but I can kind of weight them differently. And then also some of the pieces, it's built with the idea that this would be kind of a tile-based game where you would have tiles and move units around on. So some of the tile-based, the sort of tile areas that will be created will be quite small. So if we look at, for example, this little sliver here, that's too small for a game tile. Whereas this piece here is actually a bit too large for a game tile. But then in the analysis step, I save all that information. And when I then relax the grid afterwards, pieces that know they want to be larger, they get to try to expand, and pieces that know they actually don't need to be that large, they kind of leave some room for the others and are allowed to contract somewhat. And so that's kind of one of the smoothing steps I'm running. But then I'm actually running a secondary smoothing step once I've relaxed the sort of cage deformation. I smooth the actual mesh after that as well. At that stage, I got to be a bit more careful because I can accidentally do things like flip triangles inside out or make paths too small so you can't work on them. So that's kind of a very sort of soft kind of generation where you need a lot of iteration to tweak magic numbers and stuff like that. And the end results are these kind of what I think are fairly natural looking environments. So you get these from what you would get from a square grid, you get these kind of long, straight sections, but then you also get these nice corners that aren't entirely straight, and you get some beaches that are mostly straight, but then you don't get these wobbly lines that you would get from a hexagonal grid. So I think it's a pretty nice mix of all of it. And also one of the benefits of using a tile-based system is you know exactly what's going into it. So you know that the basic topology of what you're giving it is going to be valid and it's going to fit for your gameplay purposes. So I know straight out of the box that this is kind of going to be, I'm going to be able to divide this into distinct tiles of roughly the same size that I can then use for gameplay. Whereas if I would base this on, for example, just a 2D height field that I would run an erosion algorithm on and stuff like that, creating a sort of discrete playable space where you know that a navigable path is wide enough and there's discrete tiles and there's those kind of gameplay elements would be much, much more difficult. So that's a benefit of tile generation in general. And of course, like tiles, you can tag them with different things and you can add other kinds of objects on them. Oh, that's also a thing with the way I talked about slicing things up for Townscaper, for example. It works very well for most things, slicing them up like that, so a house is made out of several corners. But one fairly critical thing it doesn't actually work that well for at all, which is windows and doors. Because that means that actually, if I build a little house like that, the door actually happens to be right at the seam of where two modules meet. So obviously one solution, but that's a very laborious solution, would be to just create half a door on all the tiles that would sit on the ground. That's a bit of a mess, and if you need to change the look of the door, it means going through all your tiles and just changing the half of the door that appear in all your tiles. Instead, what I'm doing here is I also needed a prop placement system. So all the buildings and everything that's sort of connected together, that's made out of modules from the wave function collapse and skewed into place. But then I also have little things like these little Wellington boots and the little post box and this periscope and the bushes. And that's made from a prop placement system. That just has locations it tries to place props, but then they shouldn't overlap. And it tries to place as many props as possible without overlapping them. And I use the same system to place the windows and the doors as well. But then I use some clever stencil buffer tricks so that they can actually it looks like they cut a hole into the wall, though they don't actually properly. And that also means that I can animate the walls and the doors like I can animate the rest of the props. So if you build like this, you can kind of see them sliding back and forth a bit, which I think gives it a very sort of nice organic look. Yeah, another thing I'm managing to achieve in this project that I really wanted to do for Bad North and been wanting to do for other projects, but I haven't been able to before, is have this nice mix of very clear, distinct cliffs. That's great for gameplay because you can you can see clearly where you can walk and where you can't walk here. That's perfect. But I also want really nice, gentle slopes. And want that kind of combination of that. I'm guessing, I don't know that yet, but I'm guessing for gameplay purposes that's going to be quite interesting because if you're standing at a location like this, you know you're very well protected against enemies coming from here, but you're very poorly protected from enemies coming backwards. Whereas if you have more sort of just distinct height levels in the game, they might be protected from all directions. And it also just gives a much more sort of natural environment look to it. And of course, one way I'm achieving this is when I'm building the tile-based environment, the slopes actually, go like this in discrete steps, but then I just smooth them in the post-process step. This is a very simple way of achieving that same thing. So this is still very early. I have a bunch of ideas on how to make this look even better. Of course, more kinds of detailed modules going into it, but also a thing I'm going to try doing is actually doing procedural texturing of this thing. So I'm figuring if I can write a UV map script that UV maps this, and then I could probably kind of procedurally just paint it with brush strokes as you generate it. I don't think that's going to be very difficult, and I think it's going to be a way to give it a very nice organic look, and also a way to be able to achieve kind of textural elements that are very hard to achieve with tiling textures. So for example, if you want kind of brush strokes that follow the sloping of the or the way that water would flow down this environment, I think it's actually not going to be that difficult to program those kind of things, but it'd be very difficult to do with a tiling texture system kind of thing. How are we doing with time? Yeah, I think that's mostly the kind of things I wanted to cover. So I wanted to leave as much space as possible for questions at the end. So anyone have any questions so far? Yeah? Should have it generating in the background as we...
Yeah, so I was going to ask, it's sort of a two-part question.
Yeah.
In Townscaper, are you able to change the base quad grid in the bottom? Like if you want to edit the world and you have a hexagonal quad, could you allow the player to change the black grid on the bottom there?
Yeah. So I don't allow the player to change it. You could let the player change it, but I think it would be very difficult to make that kind of tool intuitive to the player. Like designing these kind of things is quite of a weird thing to do. Actually, so the way I did it instead is basically here's the grid, but the grid actually keeps going, and it keeps going theoretically infinitely. So when you start building, you get constrained to the area around where you're building, but before you start building, you can just scroll around and find a nice area where you like the shape of the grid. And there's also actually some, if you keep going for quite a bit, I have a system for how I generate this kind of grid. It's based on kind of triangulating things and then joining some of those triangles into quads, and then subdividing everything so everything turns into quads, which is actually quite similar to what I was doing in the other thing. But I also introduced a bunch of hand-placed grid or hand-designed grid patches. So here I found a long section of straight grid, you can see, and if you run along that sort of road of straight grid, you'll find little sort of symmetrical bits like this. And on the symmetrical bits, there's kind of a little magical thing that you can do, or the circular bits, because there you can build flying structures. And the reason you can build flying structures, there we go, get some propellers. And the reason you can build flying structures, it's sort of a bug at first that I then kind of leaned into, because the way I place these kind of steel supports for it is that they just, there's no kind of structural analysis of the thing you build. What happens is all the corners need to have a leg on them. And then, the wave function lab figures out, then I have a bunch of leg structures built into the algorithm, or modules that I give to the algorithm. So as soon as I have a hanging corner like that, it needs to have a leg, and then the rest of the structure has to figure out, okay, how do I make sure there's a leg here? So here, of course, there's a pretty simple case where it goes all the way to the ground. But if you build more sort of weird things like this, you get you might get the legs joining up like this. I really enjoyed making these. This is also where the algorithm fails the most. But if you build something in a loop where the grid is looping around like that, there's no corners. It's like, essentially, it's just running a straight line. It's just that the space is curved. So you get no corners. And then, so at first, when I discovered this, or it was actually some users that discovered this, they found some like vaguely large amorphous shapes that were rounded just by accident. And then I leaned into it, I added the propellers, and then I also added all these handcrafted areas in the game with a lot of circular grid. But to come back to your question, like designing those kind of handcrafted grid bits, that was super fun for me. But it's a pretty abstract, weird process that like someone who's into 3D modeling and mathematics and graphs probably enjoy quite a lot, but might be quite confusing for someone like not used to those kind of things. And if you do it the wrong way, it doesn't look that good. If you make a weird topology, you'll end up with like very, very small quads and very, very large quads, and they're very, very skewed. So when I build these manually, I of course try to achieve fairly uniformly sized quads. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Second, my other question related to that is like this base quad grid that you have is like irregular instead of like this either hexagonal grid or regular grid. Have you experimented with like extending that into 3 dimensions where like, say, in this game, if you built like an extremely high building, they would still be straight. I mean, you're extruding from the bottom.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see like, could you make that variation of a grid work in 3D space so that a building could work like this? You understand?
I understand your question. I've thought a lot about that. It's actually I don't have a theoretical solution for it. It's a very difficult. It's easy to vary things on the plane, but then as soon as you start adding another, like, there's a lot of different shapes that tessellate on the. Well, there's not a lot of different, but there's a couple of different that tessellate on the ground. You know, there's triangles, there's like trapezoids, there's squares and hexagons, but there's very few shapes that tessellate in 3D. So, like most sort of crystal structures in nature as well are either made out of, like they're mostly interesting in 1 dimension or in 2 dimensions, but then they're just like layered in the other dimension, like graphite, for example. So I don't actually know if it's possible to do in a regular way. You could do it with tetrahedra, but then it would be quite skewed tetrahedra, and tetrahedra is not a good. Like, it's very hard to make tetrahedral models that make sense, build architecture out of tetrahedral models. No, it's a very difficult problem. In this other project, I'm obviously doing quite a bit sort of like that, because I'm skewing the grid in 3D afterwards. But that's after I've decided which of the grid tiles in 3D are important and which are not. So obviously then the ones that are just in space, that don't have any graphical data in them, I discard, and I don't have to compromise with them. And likewise, the ones where I have like 2 opposite walls, yeah, the grid cells meet, but there's nothing connecting them properly, so I can kind of relax them separately. So in a way, I'm doing a bit of that here, but actually, I don't know if there's any good way to fill space sort of vertically in any other way than just extruding it straight up like that. But if you come up with anything interesting, do let me know.
It seems like a hard problem to solve. That's why
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
It would be interesting to know, like, if you've experimented with it.
Yeah, I have a little bit, but I've not gotten anywhere. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello, yes. I was wondering regarding the colored little circles and the lines when you were importing the assets.
Yeah.
Do you fit them manually, or do your import script actually figure out where to color them?
Oh, my import script figures it out. Yeah. I mean, the colors are not actually what's driving the colors are just a representation for me, so I can quite easily see, like, do these seem to fit? Sometimes I get things that don't fit but have the same color, because obviously the color space isn't that large.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, the import script does all that.
Could you quickly explain how you do it? Do you analyze the geometry? Or?
Yeah, I analyze the geometry. I see what edges lie around the border of the sort of cell I'm currently working in, and then I create a hash from that. And then, you know, things that are shaped the same way should create the same hash.
Yeah.
And that, but sort of designing those hashes is kind of an art in and of itself. Yeah. You need to round things quite a bit, so you don't get like precision error things. You need to round them, but of course, when you're rounding things, they might end up at slightly different like sides of the rounding. So you need good ways to also verify, and you need to do the rounding correctly so that you know that if I place something at half, like I will get a definite number. You don't want a rounding border to be at like half or quarter, because those are like actually positions you're going to use quite a bit.
Do you include like color information and normal information in the hashing process, or is it just positional?
Yes, I use a little bit of normals, though I actually differentiate that per material. So the way I'm technically doing this in Maya is I mark up different faces and give them different materials, because those materials will later inform a bunch of things about, like, is this a navigable triangle? You know, is this water? Is this cliff? And what? So that determines how they're supposed to be analyzed. And some things like land doesn't really care about the normals. So that means that you can go straight from a slope into a straight plane like that, because otherwise I'd have to make transition things that go from a straight thing to a slope, and I didn't want to have to make all those combinations. Whereas with the cliffs, I do have to respect all the normals all the time, because the land is supposed to be soft and smooth anyway, but the cliffs is like the hard edges is a lot of what tells the story about the shape of the cliffs. So there I do use the normals, but I don't use the normal normals, I use the face normals. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I don't use, and then the normal normals are going to be recreated anyway later after I do all the smoothing and everything like that. Yeah, but then I actually also, in this case, and I haven't done this in my previous projects, I actually cut up the, I not only take the triangles and divide them into different modules, but I actually slice the triangles. And then I'll simplify that sliced geometry as well, which is a pretty fun thing to write, because obviously if I need to cut them into triangles both one way and the other way, and then also do like some shifting around of the verts and cut them again and cut them vertically and stuff like that. It was yeah, it was time to write a proper slicing algorithm. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a good approach in general when doing tile-based thing to figure out how to need to do as little manual markup as possible. Because if you do a tile-based thing and you need to like manually mark up, hey, this corner is dirt, this corner is land, this is sea, and stuff like that, it becomes very tedious to iterate and create new pieces. So if you can figure out ways to mark it up in ways that are very simple, so for me this means marking the triangles in different colors in Maya, that's much better, and derive as much information as possible in the sort of in an automatic analysis step instead of marking things up manually. Yeah.
Hi. So we're building a town from scratch in our game,
yeah.
And we did a much more basic version of the grid you have in the bottom.
Yeah.
And I was just like an open question, like, where do you think one would like proceed? Because we did just like subdividing a square until you get enough of like different parts of the town, and everything is like squared. And then you like just skew everything to make it a little bit interesting. So from your perspective, going through all of this, where would you like, that next step would be to do this kind of thing to make the grid? Like your thing in the beginning, in the bottom, right there, you had a name of that algorithm, which I've seen in code bases, Duality something. What did you do?
Do you mean Voronoi?
No, the triangle thing.
The wave function collapse thing?
No,
the Catmull-Clark subdivision?
Delaunay.
Oh, Delaunay triangulation.
Exactly.
Yeah, Delaunay triangulation.
So could you talk like, where would you go if you were stuck, almost not stuck, but you know, like, I want to see like, how can I grab that sort of thing, and what type of area do I need to research the most to be able to do nicer grids?
So first of all, Townscaper doesn't use Delaunay triangulation really anywhere. Delaunay triangulation is kind of basically like if you look at a triangular grid and it looks the nicest it can, it's probably Delaunay triangulated. That's when you get the few, like you don't get a lot of skinny long triangles. They try to create as sort of evenly shaped triangles as possible. That's sort of a quick version of what it is. And that is what I'm doing at the start.
All right. Yeah.
At the start here, I'm creating a triangle grid, and then I'm Delaunay triangulating it as I go to make it as nice looking as possible. But of course, so what you talked about there sounded like you basically create a square grid, but then you just kind of skew it a bit after the fact.
Yeah, I just subdivide the big one, and then subdivide that one, and then subdivide everything into halves until I get the right size that we want to.
Yeah.
And then we skew everything a little bit.
Yeah. So a drawback of that is that you're skewing it, but you're not changing the fundamental topology.
Exactly.
So, and there's also pretty big limits to how much you can skew it then, because there's always going to be this strain from the fundamental topology. So that's why, and you'll never get, like I have in Townscaper, these triangles and pentagons and hexagons. So if you want interesting topology while kind of letting the quads remain somewhat uniform in size, you're going to need something like this. But it's so a good way to illustrate what's going on here in Townscaper when I generate these kind of things is you can just take any model inside a 3D package, and then if you just hit subdivide once, it will all be made out of quads. So if you have a triangular model with a bunch of triangles, and then you hit subdivide, then it will be all made out of quads, because every triangle will become, every quad will become 4 quads, and every triangle will become 3 quads. And then that's basically what I'm doing here. When I generate the grid in Townscaper, the ones that aren't the bits that aren't manually built, I create a bunch of triangles, and then I join some of them into quads, and then I subdivide them.
So it's just random triangles from the beginning?
No, I start with nice even triangles, so in a perfect hexagon.
Oh, right. So you
shape.
have like the raw grid, a big one, and then you just start dividing everything up.
Yeah, sort of. I generate it in chunks. You can see the chunks getting sort of. So here's a you can see it getting generated in chunks.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, because exactly what you said is like all the issues that we like run into in like time. Just like no, let's just make it square everything.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is a good idea if it's not what you're.
Looks so much nicer. I would love to have this in our game for more European looks as well. So yeah, thanks.
Here we can see, and you can kind of see where something, like here you can see a hexagon that was clearly made out of, like this used to be a big triangle, this used to be a big triangle, and then these joined up into a square, and here these joined up into a square, and these joined up into a square, and then it was all subdivided. Yeah. You can kind of see the remnants of those shapes. But in some things I subdivide kind of in a more chaotic way. So.
Perfect. Thanks.
But this is very much like I start with the tech and then I create a game out from there. Obviously, a lot of people start with the game and then they need tech that satisfy those constraints, and they might not have time to do all the kinds of things that I'm doing. So, yeah. More questions?
Yeah, we have 2 Discord questions.
Yep.
First one, how did you manage to merge the different 3D parts without shading issues in the UV seams?
Well, there are UV seams. There's tons of UV seams. You just don't really notice them, because as long as there's no... Like, first of all, I have very subtle texturing. Like, if you look at the brick textures I have going on, they're super subtle and vague. And that's also, I think, a very good aesthetical choice, because as I said before, you don't need to actually tell the player over and over, hey, this is brick, this is brick, this is brick, this is brick. If they look at the wall, they should be able to tell it's brick, but when they're looking at other things, I don't need to shout that at them. And if the texture is very subtle, then you don't really see the seams. Yeah, so it's the same color, but there's UV. Like here you can see this little brick here is kind of 2 different colors. No, actually you can't really see on the projector. Maybe you can see a little bit. So I have UV seams running through the place. Of course, you just keep an eye out for them, and if there are areas where they're more noticeable and you need to, like UV seams within interesting features, you obviously want to avoid those. But I think this, like, doing this for Townscaper is not really different from caring about UV seams in any kind of modular environment. You always need to care a little bit about it, but in subtle areas, it probably doesn't matter that much. Of course, it helps that I have this style that's made out of... It's actually another kind of trick I'm using where, like, you see the lines on the roof are kind of pixel thin and pixel perfect, and if you zoom out and out, they keep being pixel thin and pixel perfect, and that kind of helps keeping this kind of drawn 2D look to it. It looks like it's been drawn by a pen, but it also helps like all the textures of radically different scales still look like they fit together because the lines are always perfectly pixel thin. And as long as the lines match up properly at the seams, I can get away with a lot of other things not matching up properly. Yep.
Yeah. Second question is, so the Windows doors in Townscaper use a Boolean operator to delete the wall part.
Yeah. Well, is that a question? That's a question.
That's
yeah.
a question.
Yeah. Sort of, but not really. It's not a proper Boolean because it doesn't actually manipulate the mesh. It's a fake Boolean in the stencil buffer. Yeah. So it's some stencil buffer tricks to kind of. So I draw the windows twice, once to sort of cut a hole, and once inside out, only inside the hole. This is fairly common to do for windows or maybe bullet holes in some games, or the classic problem of you have a boat in the game and you don't want the water of the sea to be visible inside the boat. You might use a stencil buffer trick as well. They're a bit messy to sort of get working, keep your head straight while you're working with it, but yeah, it's a stencil buffer trick. So actually, if you can export the meshes you build from Townscaper to OBJ files. I did that because I wanted to see people make 3D prints out of them. But then you can see that the windows you export are actually little blocks sitting on like cubes sitting on the side of the buildings. So a lot of people in their 3D prints have windows sticking out rather than sticking in, because you need to do a Boolean operation yourself in like Blender or something. But yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? No more questions. I should have had a longer talk. Yeah. Do I have anything more interesting to show, maybe? Yeah, I have something more interesting to show. So another thing I'm doing in Townscaper, because I do have quite a lot of time. Yeah, I'll have a little bit of time. Another thing I'm doing in Townscaper that I'm fairly happy with is the Ambient Occlusion, the lighting system, which obviously has to be done like on the fly. It has to work on mobile phones and Switch as well. So we can actually turn on just lighting mode. And here you'll see the ambient occlusion and the lighting. The shadows are, of course, just standard shadow mapping, but the ambient occlusion is quite a different beast. And it's made in this way. If we select the, here's my AO Baker. So here you can see kind of the different slices of the world. And as you're building it, you'll see this sort of extending upward. So it's like an atlas, like a 3D texture, basically, but not really a 3D texture, but sort of. And I'm baking the kind of general voxel shape of what you're doing onto, let's see, because now we flew away quite a bit before we started building things here. We should like this, and go here. There we go. Delete the... Oh, that should be, well, you can see a bunch of weird voxels going on here. I don't exactly remember what I'm using those for, maybe some collision or something. And then you should have, oh, right, that's sitting in a weird spot. Okay, let's create a new scene. But I'm kind of creating a polygon, a flat sort of polygon representation of the, yeah, here we see, like this is basically that atlas made out of polygons. So if I keep building here, blip, 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 blip. And you'll see the colors as well. Here's the thing I just built in different slices. And since this is just a very simple polygonal mesh, I can just bake this very quickly down into a texture and then sample that texture as a sort of distance field in, I can even do it in a vertex shader because it's a low resolution. And then I can create a very simple AO effect on the fly. And I can keep sort of, because as you keep adding things, of course, the sort of atlas can change shape fairly radically. Obviously, if I build tall, it needs to expand one way, but if I build very wide, it needs to expand another way. And since it's all saved, like not really to a texture, but mostly to a polygonal mesh, I can just keep reprojecting this polygonal mesh onto the render texture very, very quickly as you keep changing the dimensions of the atlas. Yep. And it's a very easy way. It's a very similar way I did the ambient occlusion for Bad North as well. Where it's sort of voxel-based kind of ish fake ambient occlusion. It's very simple to set up and runs fast. Yep. Okay. That's
Just came up.
Yep.
The reflections in in the water.
Yep.
Is that a screen space or is it like a planar reflection? It looks really nice.
Yeah, it's the mesh again, upside down. Classic trick. I think I really enjoy. I've kind of like all my projects are things set in the water, and the reason for that is partly because you don't need to make a horizon or LODs in the environment. And water has this nice, you kind of frame things nicely. It's abstract, but it's concrete at the same time. So you could just place something into the void, but then it's clearly a statement that it's abstract. But if you place water there, it kind of is a void, but it's also water, so it's also something, and you don't need to care about LODs for trees in the backgrounds. But of course, if you have things in the water, you need reflections. Here are the reflections. It's just it's a flip version of the mesh with a special shader on it that makes it, wobble a little bit and stuff like that. I think, in general, making reflections is a very interesting aesthetical thing in a highly stylized game, because you don't want the reflections to be just an accurate reflection of the thing you're making. You actually want it to be a very simplified thing. So you need to think the same things you need to think about when you think about stylization in general, like how do I abstract these shapes, how do I combine details together, make some things more readable, some things less readable, remove a lot of things. It's a lot about removing things, place outlines on some things, not on other things. You need to think about that with the reflections as well. So the reflections are less important than the thing you're building, so they need to be much less abstract. So they kind of, or much more abstract, sorry. So what they do in Townscaper is they do pick up the colors of the walls that you're building. So if I build green things, you will get green house in the reflections. Yeah. But it doesn't pick up any of the doors or windows or any props like that. That's a conscious, I mean, it's both, that was easier technically because those are part of a different system and a different mesh. But also it's an aesthetical choice because the reflection doesn't need to be, it shouldn't be that detailed anyway. Yep.
Cool, thanks.
All right, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are going to have another quick break here on the main stage, and we're going to be back at 12 o'clock with another talk. So I'll see you soon.
Mm-hmm.